The sun hung low over the sprawling fields of Blackwood Manor, casting long, trembling shadows that danced across the cotton rows like secretive whispers. Lady Evangeline St. Clair moved through the house with a kind of restless grace, her silk skirts brushing against the worn floorboards, each step echoing softly like a heartbeat in the quiet halls. She had been taught to command with decorum, to maintain the appearance of civility, yet within her chest stirred a curiosity, an ache for something forbidden, something beyond the gilded cage of her lineage. It was in the heat of this restless dusk that she found herself drawn to Thomas, a man whose quiet strength was felt more than seen, whose eyes carried the weight of the earth itself. Their stolen moments in the orchard were brief, heavy with unsaid words and glances that lingered too long. Evangeline felt a thrill she could neither name nor suppress, unaware that in the shadows of the fields, other lives were quietly being altered by the same man she had chosen to trust. It was a secret that would soon surface like the roots of the ancient oaks lining the estate, inevitable, gnawing, and unstoppable. The women of the plantation, whose laughter once filled the quarters with the fragile hope of freedom in small things, now carried a silent truth beneath their breasts. And when the realization came to Evangeline, it was not in anger but in the hollow ache of betrayal and the stark, poetic cruelty of fate. She walked the corridors that night, her candle flickering against the walls, casting grotesque shapes that seemed almost to mock her. The manor, so long a symbol of control and comfort, had become a stage for secrets too heavy to bear. And yet, despite the darkness, a strange fascination held her, an awareness of the frailty and chaos that desire could summon. The morning mist hung low over the fields, curling around the cotton bolls like pale fingers, and Evangeline wandered along the edge of the orchard, the cool air doing little to settle the storm inside her. She had heard whispers, quiet murmurs from the quarters, but dismissed them as gossip, the kind that thrived in the spaces between labor and rest. Yet, her intuition, sharpened by a life of careful observation, told her otherwise. Thomas moved among the workers as always, his hands skilled and sure, his presence commanding without a word. Evangeline watched him from a distance, the tension coiling in her chest like a serpent. The orchard, once a place of stolen laughter and secret glances, now seemed a theater of suspicion and unspoken truths. It was not malice that twisted the hearts of the plantation's women, but a quiet despair, a realization of the powerlessness woven into the very air they breathed. Each day, they bore the weight of hidden consequences, and yet, in the hushed corners of the quarters, they found ways to assert the faintest glimmers of agency, soft rebellions, small acts of defiance that Thomas would never suspect. Evangeline could no longer ignore the change in the atmosphere. She felt the subtle shift in Thomas's gaze, the way he lingered too long on fleeting shadows, the careful avoidance of her own questioning eyes. The truth, she realized, had a way of burrowing into the earth beneath her feet, and once it took root, it could not be easily uprooted. That night, she sat alone in the grand hall, candlelight flickering against the ornate wallpaper, casting ghostly silhouettes that seemed almost alive. The house, so often a symbol of order and elegance, now whispered of secrets and betrayal. Evangeline traced the outline of her reflection in the polished surface of a silver tray and felt the first stirrings of a bitter clarity. Desire, when untamed, can become a mirror that reflects more than one's own longings. Somewhere beyond the walls, the women of the quarters moved silently, carrying within them a truth that no silk gown or polite society could obscure. And in that silence, Evangeline understood, the plantation, with its sprawling acres and shadowed halls, was a vessel not just of wealth, but of consequences, and she had been swept into its depths far beyond her reckoning. The quarters were hushed that evening, the air thick with the scent of smoke, earth, and quiet endurance. The women moved like shadows, their eyes holding both sorrow and something fiercer, defiance in the face of what they could not yet name aloud. Evangeline, drawn by curiosity and dread alike, wandered near the edge of the slave dwellings, listening to the soft cadence of whispered names, of secret fears. It was there, in the dim light of a lantern swinging gently from a rafter, that she first felt the weight of betrayal not just as rumor, but as living truth. The women bore themselves differently now, a strange strength in their posture, an unspoken understanding that they carried a truth she could not yet bear. And in the center of it all, Thomas moved, unaware, perhaps, of the storm he had sown, or perhaps choosing to ignore it, as men of power often did. Evangeline's heart quivered between indignation and fascination. She realized then that the life she had sought, stolen moments of pleasure, an escape from the gilded loneliness of her world, had only entangled her in something far more complex and perilous. The threads of desire, deceit, and consequence were entwined, and she had become part of the tapestry. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. The orchard, once a sanctuary, had become a stage of subtle confrontation. Evangeline watched from the veranda as Thomas tended the fields, his movements practiced and deliberate, yet her eyes caught the fleeting glances exchanged with the women of the quarters. The glances were silent accusations, warnings, acknowledgments of an invisible bond forged through shared suffering. Evangeline felt a strange mixture of guilt and obsession. She understood, perhaps too late, that desire without foresight is a kind of blindness. The quiet tragedy of the plantation, the lives constrained by wealth, social expectation, and oppression, was now intertwined with her own story. Every shadow seemed to whisper truths she did not want to hear, and yet could not ignore. One afternoon, she found herself wandering into the orchard alone, her fingers brushing against the rough bark of an ancient oak. Beneath its heavy branches, she imagined the invisible lives she had trespassed upon, the invisible consequences that had already begun to unfold. And in that shadowed grove, she began to realize the depth of the moral labyrinth she had stepped into. The first true confrontation came not with words, but with the silent weight of recognition. Evangeline noticed the women in the quarters exchanging glances she could not fully decipher, yet sensed the power in their subtle unity. Thomas, unaware of the storm gathering around him, continued his work, blind to the currents swirling beneath the surface of the plantation life. Evangeline's nights grew restless. She dreamt of the orchard, of hidden glances, of shadows thickening into forms that whispered accusations and lamentations alike. The house itself seemed to respond to the tension, doors creaking where no one had passed, candles flickering as though in warning. She began to understand that her own desire, her own indulgence, had become a vessel for forces she could no longer control. By winter, the plantation had transformed. The cotton fields lay pale beneath frost, the trees stripped of their leaves, and the air carried a chill that seeped into the bones. Evangeline moved through the house with a careful grace, aware that every step echoed in the quarters, every gesture observed and weighed. The women, no longer silent, began to assert their presence. They did not speak openly of the betrayals, nor accuse Thomas in words, but the weight of their collective strength pressed upon the household like an unseen tide. Evangeline, torn between anger, fascination, and a grim sense of poetic justice, began to see the plantation as a mirror of human folly, a place where desire, power, and secrecy collided with inevitable consequence. She realized then that her longing, once innocent in its curiosity, had become entangled with the suffering and resilience of those she had overlooked. And in that realization, she felt the first true sting of empathy and regret, an understanding that some truths, once discovered, cannot be unseen. The harvest season arrived, and with it the culmination of hidden labors, unspoken truths, and quiet reckonings. The women moved with a grace born of endurance, their presence a silent testament to resilience. Evangeline wandered through the fields, witnessing the subtle, careful orchestration of lives shaped by secrets and consequences alike. Thomas, still blind to the full scope of the lives he had touched, continued his work, yet Evangeline's eyes no longer lingered in longing. Instead, they observed, measured, and understood. She had learned, in the shadow of desire and betrayal, that power is fleeting, that secrets are burdensome, and that true consequence is often carried quietly, without fanfare. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the fields in gold and shadow, Evangeline felt the heavy weight of understanding. The orchard, the quarters, the grand halls of the house, all bore witness to the intricate, tragic tapestry of human desire and error. And in that dark, poetic twilight, she understood the cruel beauty of fate, that even in indulgence, in betrayal, there is a lesson etched deep into the bones of those who live in its shadow. Winter's frost had hardened the fields, leaving the cotton pale and brittle under the gray sky. The plantation, usually alive with muted chatter and labor, now seemed suspended, as if holding its breath for the inevitable reckoning. Evangeline felt it too, the quiet pull of consequence drawing near. The women of the quarters moved with a newfound resolve. Their glances, once fleeting and shadowed, now carried weight, their whispers, once soft, had the cadence of inevitability. Evangeline realized the full scope of the truth. Thomas's indulgence had left its mark not only on her, but on those whose lives were bound to his by chains, duty, and circumstance. She confronted him one evening beneath the skeletal limbs of the orchard. The air was sharp with cold, yet the tension burned hotter than any summer sun. Words were scarce, understanding needed no elaboration. Thomas, for the first time, saw the consequences of his desire, the silent, enduring power of those he had wronged. Evangeline, feeling the bitter taste of betrayal and clarity, recognized the complexity of human frailty. Desire, once unbridled, does not respect boundaries, nor innocence. The manor's walls seemed to echo the unspoken judgment. Shadows of the past, both hers and theirs, stretched long and immutable. And in that stillness, Evangeline understood the full weight of her own complicity, the delicate balance of power, and the resilience of those who bore their suffering silently. Spring approached, but the plantation was no longer the same. The fields bloomed anew, yet beneath the bright cotton, the memory of winter lingered like a dark undercurrent. Evangeline walked through the orchard alone, the trees stripped bare by frost now budding with the first promise of life. She traced her fingers over the rough bark of the old oaks, feeling the pulse of time and consequence beneath her touch. The women of the quarters had become quiet, measured, and unyielding. Their resilience, forged in suffering, had become a force that no desire could overshadow. Evangeline, once driven by curiosity and longing, now understood the delicate balance of power and empathy, and the devastating weight of unacknowledged truths. Thomas remained among the fields, yet his presence had shifted. There was no malice, no arrogance, only a muted awareness of the lives he had touched and altered. Evangeline watched him, understanding that some lessons cannot be taught with words, only endured with the heart. The orchard, the quarters, and the grand halls of Blackwood Manor held their secrets like ghosts, silent witnesses to desire, betrayal, and the inexorable march of consequence. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in amber and shadow, Evangeline felt a strange mixture of sorrow, clarity, and awe. In the end, there was no triumphant resolution, no neatly tied closure, only the quiet reckoning of lives intertwined by desire and choice, by shadow and light, and the haunting poetry of human frailty. The plantation exhaled, and in its breath lingered the enduring truth. Some stories are written not in words, but in the spaces between, in the shadows that fall where the light cannot fully reach.